At the end of 2009, a former colleague of mine called. He had once been a Taoist priest, but due to family pressures, he abandoned his craft and ended up running a small funeral service shop that handled everything from start to finish. Although he had only been the boss for less than 5 years, he had already studied his craft for more than 10 years. His last name was One. When he called, his tone was one of helplessness. Since he was asking for my help, I knew exactly what troubled him. Ever since he returned to the family business 5 years ago, he had essentially become detached from our original field. Even though he never held a formal retirement ceremony, everyone knew he was done. During those 5 years, he had occasionally taken on private jobs without permission, and on one occasion he ended up with a blind right eye after waking up from a nap. At the time, he couldn't understand what had happened until others reminded him that it was a warning. Never forget that the ancestral master was always watching over you. On the phone, One wasn't sharing or promoting business. He was, in effect, enlisting me to handle a matter for him. Here's what happened. His cousin worked at a well-known funeral home in the Chongqing high-tech zone. His primary job was to greet the bereaved families, explaining the prices and services of each farewell haul. When a corpse arrived, he would put on a sorrowful expression, as if the death of a stranger was even more tragic than the loss of one's own family. Later, due to some work reassignments, he was moved to the columbarium, where he was responsible for handling the ashes for visitors who came to burn paper money. I used to have great respect for people in this line of work. Firstly, because their job somewhat resembled mine, and secondly, because these people generally fell into two categories. One type had an abundance of yang energy, and if ghosts were like toxins, they were already immune. The other type deeply believed that once a person died, they would enter another world, so they treated life with a deep sense of reverence, making their work noble rather than lowly. However, at some point, as respect for the deceased and an appreciation for life began to yield enormous profits, people's expressions of grief lost their sincerity, even if you wore a proper black suit and donned gloves as white as ashes. Wen's younger cousin was exactly that kind of person, lacking both the reverence for life and the courage to face death. The only reason he stayed on the job was the monthly income of over 10,000 yuan. I recall that when I was very young, the funeral business wasn't even considered a profession. It was simply life's final stop. No matter how extraordinary your life might have been, perhaps from the moment you were born, you were already on the path to death. And it was because so many people died every day that those doing business with the dead could make a modest profit. The problem Wen's cousin faced was that whenever he went to work, he had to fetch the ashes for a client based on a specific storage certificate. On the lower floors, it wasn't so bad, but on the 3rd, 4th, or 5th floors, he had to use either the stairs or the elevator. The staircase was narrow and silent, and walking alone there inevitably instilled fear. After all, you were surrounded by thousands of the deceased. On the other hand, the elevator, although more modern, still sent shivers down your spine due to its dim lighting and slow speed. The funeral home had a peculiar habit. In the elevator near the columbarium, a wooden stool covered with bright yellow silk was always placed. Yet, no one ever chose to sit on that stool. It wasn't meant for the living, but rather for the spirits escorted out for farewell and then returned. The surveillance footage in the elevator could attest to that. Wen's cousin, while riding the elevator to the 5th floor to retrieve the ashes, encountered something inexplicable. Working in such an environment, he knew there were methods to ward off evil, but this time, none worked. He even nearly lost his life. That day, as he rode the elevator to the 5th floor, Wen's cousin recited his protective incantations. However, the already dim lights in the elevator began to flicker unexpectedly, and the digital floor display started to flash erratically like a signal being interfered with. After many years on the job, he knew something was coming. In an attempt to bolster his courage, he repeated his mantra, forcing himself to be brave. But the more you try not to think of something, the more you corner yourself into it, and the fear and paranoia multiply until you can't bear it. After climbing the ladder to retrieve the ashes, on his way down he lost his grip on the urn on the final step. Fortunately, The family had not witnessed the mishap. Otherwise, one of the compartments in the columbarium might have been reserved for him. Unfortunately, the urn was chipped on one small corner. Though the damage wasn't obvious, he was terrified of being discovered. So he deliberately covered the missing piece with the red silk drape that had been on the urn, hoping to deceive the family. As he descended in the elevator, its lights still flickering, he reached the 3rd floor when he clearly heard someone exhale a cold near his ear. That breath was icy, like that of someone who had just eaten a popsicle blowing right in her ear. He was alone in the elevator, so he was certain it was the work of a ghost, perhaps upset at him for breaking the urn. He wasn't sure. From that day on, every time he went to work, he'd feel fine at first, only to suddenly find his forehead burning when he touched it, as if he had a fever. Yet, his temperature was normal. Sleepless nights followed, and within days his eyes were bloodshot and his spirit completely depleted. Eventually, he began to wonder if he had been haunted by a ghost ever since that day, with his body reacting in such strange ways. Overwhelmed by fear, he called his cousin One for help, his older cousin who once worked in the field and surely had a solution. But when refused, saying that if he continued, the next damage might be more severe than just an eye injury. Still, since they were family, when decided to entrust the matter to me, I knew that such occurrences were not unheard of. After all, we are creatures of emotion, unable to ignore the suffering of others. But this was walking a razor's edge, far more dangerous than watching someone walk on a tightrope. Yet since he had sought my help, I had to do my best. Based on Wen's description of his cousin's condition, I deduced that the most likely explanation was that he was being affected by the ghost of the one whose urn he had broken. This wasn't an unsolvable problem. After all, you brought this upon yourself, and a small punishment was all that was needed. Ghosts fear evildoers because evildoers are not afraid of death, but ghosts are not afraid of someone like his cousin who is terrified of dying. In that sense, the outcome was already decided. When told me that although his cousin had only secured his job at the funeral home through family connections, he was still family, and thus one was determined to help him. Though his tone was desperate, I knew he was also aware that I could handle the situation. Yet, as a client, he needed to play ignorant about some details. The next day, which happened to be his cousin's workday, One and I arranged to meet him. Wen's one-stop service shop was located near a factory hospital by my parents' house, a place where death occurred almost daily. A one-stop service shop near a hospital or funeral home was a guaranteed moneymaker, provided you could endure the strange looks cast by various people. I suppose most people feel that way. Whenever they hear words like funeral home, crematorium, or funeral service, an inner repulsion surfaces, stemming from a reluctance to engage with death and a fear that associating with someone who works with the dead might bring bad luck. If your significant other were in this line of work and had to touch the dead before touching you, you can imagine how that would feel. That's why almost all of my friends in this field live rather solitary lives. Apart from our small circle of close friends, it's hard for them to make real friends who don't recoil at their profession. However, they have long grown accustomed to this loneliness. Some are lucky enough to find a partner in the same line of work, and together they manage to run a thriving business. Those less fortunate spend their days in a tiny shop crowded with empty urns and paper money, repeatedly editing photos of the deceased on a computer or shouting by the roadside about the new stock of spirit money. Life goes on like this, tucked away in the most inconspicuous corners, rarely earning respect, even though they are performing the final rites for the dead. By the time we arrived at the funeral home, it was nearly noon, and the staff, including his cousin, were on break. When I first saw him, I could tell from his downcast expression that something strange was haunting him. He claimed to be physically fine, but emotionally drained. Recently, his duties had been switched to front desk reception, so he no longer had to retrieve the ashes. I swung my compass near him and immediately sensed that he was being haunted by not one but two ghosts. This immediately caught my attention because, as far as I knew, even if he had offended a ghost, it would have been only the one associated with the broken urn. I still had no answer as to why there were two ghosts clinging to him and why they were entangled with each other. I told him that to resolve the matter quickly, he needed to check the surveillance footage from the elevator and the columbarium. The outcome, it turned out, was not unexpected. Everyone in the funeral industry knew that the surveillance cameras in their facility would capture ghosts in many situations. Ghosts could appear in various forms. Some looked so normal that you could hardly tell whether they were living or dead, while others were unmistakable because of their bizarre behaviors. So, as we reviewed the footage, we were determined to see a ghost. Sure enough, when we looked up the footage corresponding to the time his cousin recalled that something was off in the elevator, we discovered that he was alone in the elevator with flickering lights whose cause was unclear. We initially chalked it up to an electrical glitch, but as events unfolded, we recalled that the unsettling movie he had seen earlier had already cast a shadow over his mind, making him tense and clumsy when retrieving the urn. When we reviewed the columbarium footage, we noticed that just after his mishap, the screen froze for about half a second. When the image resumed, a man in a black suit carrying a cane was standing next to him. The reflective floor tiles showed that this man had no shadow. Clearly, he was a ghost. In the footage, his cousin appeared extremely panicked after the fall. He looked around furtively, clearly trying to hide his mistake. His deft handling suggested that he wasn't new to such incidents. At that moment, I felt a wave of disgust toward his attitude and professionalism. I couldn't help but glance back at one who was also watching me. I believe we shared the same thought, when shook his head in apology for his cousin's behavior. Returning to the footage, I saw that his cousin had naively assumed he had covered up the accident well as he picked up the urn and walked toward the elevator. The ghost in the black suit followed him for about half the distance before suddenly extending its cane as if to hook his neck. Then, as if it were a weightless plastic bag, it was dragged toward the elevator while its feet remained motionless. Startled by what he saw, his cousin instinctively touched his neck. I thought that if Juan and I hadn't been there to review the footage together, he might never have had the courage to watch it alone. As the video reached its end, his figure was seen walking out of the elevator with his back turned to the camera, clutching the urn, while on each of his shoulders hung an old man, one dressed in black and the other in white. Frankly, I was sure that after watching this footage, his cousin would probably resign, terrified out of his mind. And it wasn't just him. Even I broke out in a cold sweat. I had seen many ghosts before, some even stranger than this, but a ghost that followed a person in this manner was truly chilling. Suddenly, a disquieting thought struck me. After hesitating for a moment, I decided to verify the footage for myself. I switched the playback to the segment recorded just outside the monitoring room's lobby, and apart from the three of us entering, the two old men were still clinging to his shoulders. Perhaps due to the lighting, they appeared somewhat translucent, their features not as clear as they had been that day. His cousin shrank into a corner by the wall, his face ashen, hands clutching his shoulders, visibly rubbing them in fear. I could almost see him on the verge of tears. Softening my tone, I told him not to be too afraid. I reasoned that since he had managed to get this far, without serious harm, he would soon be rid of this haunting. I advised him to quickly check the visitor records from that day to find the contact details of the family associated with the broken urn, so we could properly address the matter. As for the old man in white, although we couldn't determine his identity immediately, we were almost certain of two things. First, that he must have been one of the deceased in that building. After all, he knew how to use the elevator. And second, that he was somehow connected to the black-suited ghost. To find out who he was, we first had to identify the black-suited ghost. Juan's cousin was now tormented by these two ghosts. Desperate to rid himself of their presence, he agreed to follow my instructions without hesitation. He quickly mustered his courage, went to the front desk, and checked the visitor records. There, we found the names, contact numbers, and relationships of the deceased and their families. I then traced the urn by its certificate number on the 5th floor. I dared not ride the elevator. I simply couldn't face it, and chose to take the stairs instead. Looking at the photo on the urn, I recognized the old man from the footage. that confirmed that at least the black-suited ghost had appeared because his urn had been broken. Returning to the first-floor lobby, I told his cousin to prepare to apologize to the family, for I was about to call the number on the record. To uncover the truth, I had to be completely honest, even though it might startle them. Otherwise, I would have no choice but to take care of the matter, which was against my principles. I made the call, and a middle-aged man answered. After a brief introduction, I learned that the black-suited ghost was his father. They hadn't even noticed that part of his father's urn had been broken. I explained the situation to him in full detail. Initially, he was furious, thinking I was an employee of the funeral home, and threatened to hold us accountable. It wasn't until I assured him that no one else would be harmed that he fell silent. I then informed him that his father's spirit was now entangled with another unfamiliar spirit that had attached itself to one of the funeral home staff. Although his father had passed away long ago, if this continued, his spirit would only grow weaker, a disservice to both him and his descendants. Persuaded by my explanation, the man insisted on seeing the footage. Not sure where he found the courage. He probably subscribed to the seeing is believing principle. I agreed and arranged for his son to visit the funeral home that afternoon to view the video. At around 4 p.m., his son finally arrived, his face a mixture of anger, displeasure, and underlying fear. I first had Wen's cousin offer a sincere apology to the family, and thankfully, the middle-aged man was reasonable. After hearing the full story, he felt that his son couldn't be entirely blamed. Everyone has moments of carelessness and vulnerability. We then led him into the monitoring room and replayed the footage of his son carrying the urn. When his eyes fell upon the image of his father clinging to his son's shoulder, the man trembled with both shock and fear. When the white-clad old man on the stool stood up and turned around, his expression changed from shock to recognition. He suddenly pointed at the screen with a trembling index finger and said, "I know this man. He was my father's neighbor, one of his dearest friends. He passed away a few years before my father and was interred on the 3rd floor of the columbarium." With that revelation, everything began to make sense. I pieced together the events with my own theories. First, Wen's cousin, terrified, mishandled the urn, breaking the black-suited old man's remains. In anger, the black-suited ghost appeared behind him, following him with an attitude that said, "I'm upset, so I'll just stick with you." Yet, even the black-suited ghost seemed perplexed and summoned his accomplices, 2 ghosts that clung to the cousin's shoulders, one on each side. The subsequent symptoms, his burning forehead despite a normal body temperature, his overall fatigue and sleeplessness, were undoubtedly the work of these 2 spirits. I insisted that his cousin apologize not only to the family for breaking the urn, but also to the black-suited ghost, hoping that a simple gesture of contrition might persuade the ghost to let go. As for the other ghost, the white-clad one, things were trickier. But from what the middle-aged man told me, they had been the best of friends in life. I then asked him to help by contacting the white-clad ghost's children. Just to get their phone number would suffice. At that point, we prepared the black-suited ghost's ashes, purchased some incense, and real paper money. You might not believe it, but the printed Tianitong Bao style paper money was just for show. The real deal was made with yellow grass paper and copper coins. Only then, after the ashes were respectfully handled, did Wen's cousin burn the paper money while apologizing to the spirit. An interesting aspect of this funeral home was that its incineration area was divided by zodiac signs, 12 small sections for the 12 zodiac animals. I wasn't sure if that had any cultural significance, but at least when the funeral home was built in the early 1950s, the designer had clearly considered the needs of the departed. Afterwards, I chanted incantations around the urn. The old man's spirit was not as unyielding as one might think. The flames of the burning paper money told a different story. Many people have experienced a similar phenomenon. While burning paper money for a deceased loved one, the fire and smoke seem to follow you no matter where you squat. In a way, that's a good sign. It shows that you care deeply about that ancestor. Once the middle-aged man's father was sent on his way, the man suddenly grasped my hand. He said that Even after his father had passed, his spirit lingered, perhaps because something had been left undone. He was also grateful to me. Though he could only manage a few words of thanks, his eyes welled up with tears, and he was rendered speechless. I understood his meaning well. While the living often make hollow wishes for blessings, few truly consider what they can do for their ancestors after they pass away. After all, is death merely a matter of being burned and buried? Perhaps our ancestors did not leave us fortunes that could rival empires, but they did give us life. It is life that brings emotion, and through emotion we experience joy and sorrow, laughter and tears. Life continues, and so do our feelings. A few days later, the middle-aged man called to say he had contacted his father's friends' children. They had spoken on the phone, but none of them were willing to come back. He then sent me their phone numbers. I asked one to retrieve the video clip of the white-clad ghost's appearance from his cousin, and I captured a still image. I sent it as an MMS to the children, adding a note that if they didn't have time to handle the matter, I would have the ghost help out with household chores, like taking care of the kids or washing dishes. Not long after, Wen's cousin informed me that the group of siblings had returned, purchased a burial plot for the old man, and laid him to rest. Later, I found out the location of the grave. Near 6 p.m., as the cemetery was about to close, I used some pristine white stones I had collected by the riverside to build a small stone pile, beneath which I buried a single ear of wheat. I had noticed that after several years without visitors, a thick layer of dust had settled on the urn in the columbarium. I recalled that, back in those days, the broken wheat ear was used to make a broom, to sweep away the dust. No one had ever taught me this, but I believed that dust might obscure the memory of a deceased's urn, just as a stone exposed to the elements remains despite wind and sun. It was a vain hope to take away the soul while leaving behind only regret and loneliness. If you're interested in my video, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.